This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
It was a made-for-TV war.
We did not know how to get Saddam Hussein.
Now, 5 years later, what do you remember?
This looks like what I'd always imagined hell would look like.
And what were you never told?
Probably not a single Scud was intercepted by Patriot.
Tonight on Frontline, Part 1 of the Gulf War.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
In the winter of 1991, amid the burning oil wells of Kuwait, two armies faced each other in the desert. At stake were the oil fields of the Middle East and America's leadership in the world. The war in the Persian Gulf would be the first test after the Cold War of the American promise of a new world order.
The Gulf War was an American war. There were Iraqis there, and there were lots of allies in the coalition were there, but it was a U.S. war from start to finish.
For the American military, this would be a war fought on two fronts, against an Iraqi army entrenched in the desert, and against the entrenched ghosts of an old war.
The Persian Gulf War didn't last for 6 weeks. It lasted for 20 years. Vietnam is a poltergeist through this whole thing. It had a psychological dimension as a consequence of Vietnam that transcended Saddam Hussein and the invasion of Kuwait somehow in ways that made this war larger than it really was.
This is the story of what happened when America confronted Saddam Hussein and itself in the Arabian desert. It was in July 1990 when American spy satellites first photographed unusual military movement in the Persian Gulf.
My intelligence officer came in and started to show me satellite photos and other intelligence which suggested an Iraqi buildup in the southern part of Iraq. It wasn't immediately troubling because it was just a buildup within their own country. It did not have the backup that one would expect to see for an invasion of another country. The logistics system was not in place to support an invasion. They had not brought forward artillery. We couldn't see their communications coming up in a way that one would expect to see. And so although it was of interest and troubling, it did not yet become something of great concern.
The U.S. had sided with Saddam Hussein during Iraq's 8-year war with Iran. Now the Iraqi dictator was using his vast oil revenues to build nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-man army that could dominate the Middle East. But the American government was confident it could contain his ambitions.
One of the basic problems at the outset of the crisis was that the administration was convinced of the rectitude of its policy towards Iraq, which was to extend them credits and to try to build bridges to Iraq to change their behavior. They knew Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but the idea, if we build bridges, maybe we can change this fellow's way of doing business. Meanwhile, the intelligence community in the summer of 1990 was watching what Saddam Hussein did and what he said, and they were trying to send this message to their political masters that the Iraqis were serious about moving into Kuwait. But the administration just couldn't conceive that its policy was failing, and therefore they turned a deaf ear to these warnings.
In Washington that summer, President Bush was distracted by a much bigger problem: managing the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
2 months earlier, Saddam Hussein had welcomed his neighbor and ally, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Kuwait owned 1/10 of the world's oil. Iraq was rich in oil too, but Saddam's military spending had pushed his regime to the brink of bankruptcy. Saddam blamed the Emir for his troubles, accusing Kuwait of flooding the market with cheap oil, lowering prices, and hastening Iraq's descent into economic crisis.
We started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
Later that day, Saddam would issue the Emir a stark warning.
He said, each dollar less in price means to us 1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
But the Emir took a tough stand, and a month later, Saddam's inner circle decided that unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion to Iraq immediately, they would invade.
Iraq had no choice but to act, either to be destroyed, to be suffocated and strangled inside its territory, or attack the enemy on the outside.
The Republican Guard was ordered to move south toward Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi Army's elite divisions, equipped with Soviet tanks. No other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. With the crisis building, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak rushed to Baghdad, sent by Kuwait and the Arab world to arrange negotiations. Mubarak, one of America's closest allies in the region, was determined to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, inside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told him, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that. It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Baghdad, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House to report that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but that the Arabs would sort things out.
Since we didn't know the internal situation in Iraq, nor Saddam Hussein, our best bet was to take counsel from the people who did know him. And what he was really saying is, don't jump in this thing. Just let it work its way out. You got to handle this guy right.
At his headquarters in Tampa, Florida, the American military commander responsible for the Middle East was following the diplomatic developments.
Every elder statesman in the world who was an Arabist was saying, oh, this will never happen. You know, an Arab will never invade another Arab. This is all a show of force on Saddam's part, and that the Kuwaitis will cave and grant him the concessions that he was looking for, and he won't have to do this invasion.
The day after Mubarak's visit, Saddam abruptly summoned the American ambassador, April Glaspie.
And in essence, what Saddam Hussein was doing was feeling her out as to what the American position would be if the Iraqis moved against the Kuwaitis. And the response that he got was a very satisfactory one.
Glaspie repeated for Saddam the State Department's position.
This was hardly tantamount to a warning shot across the bow. She said, we're watching you, we're concerned about the bellicose statements that you've been issuing, but our fundamental feeling is that we have no direct vested interest in Arab-Arab disputes, including the dispute that you're having with the Kuwaitis over the mutual border that you share.
As the meeting ended, Saddam announced there would be more talks with the Kuwaitis. And Glaspie cabled Washington. Saddam is worried. I believe we would now be well advised to ease off on public criticism of Iraq until we see how negotiations develop. The cable reached the president's Middle East advisor at a critical moment.
I had actually written a memo to the president saying, we're getting all this intelligence, obviously concerned, when suddenly the cable from April Glaspie came. And what I did was I scribbled on the top of the memo, what I've written you may be a little bit OBE, overtaken by events, Mr. President, because things look a little bit calmer now. April's just come in with the cable, essentially saying, I think this situation's going to wind down. We Americans need to sit tight and not overreact. I think by the time George Bush went back to the residence on July 25th, the general sense was a crisis that, while probably not past, had largely peaked, and that it was on its way to getting resolved.
But the Iraqi threat was still building on the Kuwaiti border. The original 30,000 troops grew to 70,000, then 100,000. Arab leaders continued to insist it was all a bluff. Then on August 1st, the Iraqis walked out on talks when the Kuwaitis refused to meet their demands. Saddam issued his orders.
We gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion. And on a map table we were shown our objectives in Kuwait. Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We had been asked to help set up the new government.
During the crisis, Major General Wafiq al-Samarrai held a key position in Iraqi military intelligence. He says he met with Saddam Hussein nearly every day and remembers Saddam's final calculations about what America would do.
Saddam thought any reprisals would be limited and would tail off with time. He thought that America's involvement in Vietnam had badly damaged its willingness to use military power. Vietnam had been an outright defeat, militarily and politically.
As they spoke, a satellite took this photograph. American intelligence analysts searched for the bases which had been crammed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks, but when they found them, they were empty. The Republican Guard was on the move. More photographs arrived showing assault helicopters at Iraqi airfields within striking range of Kuwait. U.S. Defense Intelligence issued its highest alert, WatchCon 1.
Schwarzkopf came up to the meeting place of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the 1st of August. And it was in that meeting that it all sort of clicked for me that this could no longer be just a feint or a demonstration, but it was a serious, serious threat to Kuwait.
I explained to them that I was quite sure that this was a plan. I couldn't guarantee them that they were going to invade, but I felt that all the indications were there that they were going to invade.
As I walked out of that meeting with Secretary Cheney, I said, Dick, this cannot be just a feint, and we've got to try to get some kind of message off immediately.
I was essentially deputized to go back to the White House, to meet with Scowcroft and the president, and to convince them to take one last shot at trying to influence Saddam. And just as we were talking about what exactly he would say to Saddam in this last effort to get him to think twice before doing anything, that's when the phone rang saying, "We just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started, this war, or whatever it is, has begun."
Well, on that morning, I was woken up by a large explosion, and I looked out the window, and there's the tower, all in a pall of smoke. I thought, hello, hello, we got a problem going on here.
Republican Guard tanks sealed off the city, while Iraqi special forces seized government buildings. The advancing Iraqis met little resistance. The emir had stood down his army to avoid provoking Saddam. Many of his soldiers were taking their summer vacations.
I received a call from a friend in the foreign ministry, and he told me that the foreign minister said that now, and stressed now, is the time for the U.S. to act. And I said to him, there may have been a time to act yesterday, there may be a time to act in the future, but I don't know what we can do right now.
For us, it was shocking. Shocking. I couldn't believe that this could happen in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein, we were very in good terms, and he was a friend. We know each other very well, but didn't expect him to do that.
By noon, Saddam Hussein controlled 1/5 of the world's oil.
Saddam probably figured the Arab world and the world at large would bitch and moan for a couple of days, and then people would get used to it. And the world would essentially learn to live with it. And the United States, which had left Lebanon a decade before and so forth, was not going to do anything. And even if the United States wanted to do something, the local Arabs would never do anything. They would never work with the United States and stand up to Saddam. So I think Saddam took the pretty intelligent decision that he could probably get away with it.
President,
Yeah, Helen.
do you contemplate intervention as one of your options?
We're not discussing intervention. I would not discuss any military options, even if we'd agreed upon them. But one of the things...
The president summoned his National Security Council to confront the crisis. But Bush's confused statement to the press set the tone for the subsequent meeting. It was rambling and inconclusive.
We really needed some time to come to grips with this basic fundamental question of our strategic assessment of what this meant. Did it matter that he'd taken Kuwait?
The notion of Iraq, which was an oil powerhouse in itself, acquiring the Kuwaiti resources, and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC, was a tremendous danger to the United States and to the industrialized world. I thought it made a lot of difference.
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about it, about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
Waiting in Aspen for the president was the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The victor in the Falklands was already thinking about war.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out, and really